Sometimes when we think about love, there are words that come to our mind that sound really expansive. Unconditional love, or love without limits, or everlasting love. And whatever I'm giving, it's just infinite. However, I want to challenge that and say that just because you're loving someone unconditionally doesn't mean you're loving them without any boundaries.
Hi, I'm Bethany.
And I'm Joseph.
And the thing about love is,
love needs some boundaries. Boundaries, sometimes they get a bad rap, and we think of them as things you need to put in place when things start going poorly or when people are getting up in your space. But really, that's not what boundaries are about. And no matter how good your relationship is, you need to have some boundaries.
Boundaries is an interesting word because you do think of like something in its way, but I feel like...
Yeah, I think of that as being an obstacle.
True.
Obstacles are in the way. Boundaries are actually limits that are set for a reason.
Mm-hmm. What is a boundary? Like, what would you define a boundary as?
Well, a line that defines what's going to happen in this context. For example, when you're driving, things happen in different places on the road depending who you are. So like in our city, we have an HOV lane. So if you have more than one person, you can go in a special lane, but it's a boundary that you're not supposed to cross unless you are in that category. Like if you have a bunch of people in your car, you can go in that lane. If not, you need to stay in the other lane.
Yeah. And I love that you're describing it as like a driving thing because I think of like our daughter who's learning how to drive and I'm like, just stay in your lane.
I think of lanes as being something that helps define the expectations for the people on the road. I mean, imagine a world in which no one knew what side of the road to drive on or how fast they should go or when to change lanes. Everything would be slower and there'd be more wrecks, I think.
It reminds me of that time when I went to Ireland and I had to drive on the opposite side of the road and I wasn't used to that. And it just creates all kinds of chaos.
I didn't complain at her at all about her driving in that case.
Well, that's because you weren't there.
Yeah, she did not take me to Ireland with her. You went to Ireland without me, maybe that should have been a boundary. You can't go to Ireland, not take me with you.
Oh, that would have been an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah.
You wouldn't fit in my bag.
Almost every one of those lines you can cross under certain conditions. So it's not like crossing those lines are a terrible thing.
No.
It's like you need to know when and how those lines should be crossed, and then everyone's expectations are the same.
That's what I was about to say, expectations. It helps those expectations, which helps, I feel like people be like, okay, I got this.
Yes.
Because I know what to expect.
Have you ever felt like you were in a relationship with somebody and there weren't proper boundaries, so that maybe that person's idea of what side of the road to drive on and your idea were different, and maybe you felt like there is a lot of collisions in this relationship?
If you were to say, whatever, do whatever, I don't care. Actually, that's what it is. It would sound like I don't care.
I remember talking to a student one time and we were talking about her curfew, and she said, I can stay out as late as I want. And I said, well, your parents must trust you. And she said, no, my parents just don't care. And I thought in her case, she wasn't happy about having no curfew. She was almost discouraged that her parents didn't care that she was out all the time. I feel like I want there to be some boundaries. If I felt like you didn't care what I went out and did, or I could never do anything that would make you jealous or hurt your feelings, I'd feel like you must not be very close to me, actually.
And I think the boundaries also help me feel, when they're in place and I know what they are, that I can trust you more because we've already set up these expectations. There are different types of boundaries. One type is a physical boundary.
So, physical boundary, an example would be?
Us not being alone with the opposite sex for an extended period of time. Just, safety for ourselves and for other people.
She was afraid I was gonna get mugged by a girl.
Yeah, that's really what it was.
Knowing what your boundaries are sometimes in a relationship is very freeing. It's not there to restrict you. It's this idea of when you're in a particular context, you kind of know what to expect. You know what they expect, you know what you expect, and so you don't have to ask yourself like, is she gonna be mad about this or not, because we have set some boundaries. And you might need physical boundaries in place. Maybe you're somebody who needs some physical space, but you might also need something like emotional boundaries.
So what is an example of an emotional boundary that we've put in place?
I think one of the biggest things for me is I'm all about being nice to each other, and now you're gonna argue. If you're in a relationship, you're gonna have a disagreement at some point, but I don't want to be name calling. We have been very cautious about when we get upset or we're dealing with something, I don't call her names. We don't do that. And I think for me, that would be crossing a line where I'd find it really hard to continue in that conversation because it just changes the whole vibe.
I think another boundary that we have put in place is social boundaries, how we talk about our spouse to other people. It's one thing to go to your spouse and say, I'm struggling with you because of this. And it's a totally other thing to go start talking to all your friends and all your family about what you're struggling with.
I remember when we first got married and we were new and we were spending some time around some older married couples, and they would have these conversations that seemed really negative to me about, yeah, my wife is always doing this or always doing that. If you know me, if you've ever had lunch with me or anything, you've probably never heard me say anything about her derogatory. If I have a problem with her, I go talk to her.
Yeah.
Or I'll go talk to somebody who's a professional, like a therapist or a counselor, and I don't go complaining about her to my friends. Be careful with this line. I think there's a difference between admitting to close friends or something that we're going through a difficult time and me and her have been, dealing with some challenges, than villainizing your spouse. I think that is a boundary we've set in place. We don't do that.
Yeah.
And then there are things like ethical boundaries, which I really think, I don't know how you can have a relationship and not have ethical boundaries. Lying is not okay. There's not really any context in which I feel like I'd be okay to find out that she lied about something to me. What you want to do is give appropriate access with your boundaries. So it allows people to access you and to have relationships with you in healthy and proper ways.
Boundaries also are not somebody else's responsibility to police. So if I have a boundary that's my personal boundary that isn't within our relationship necessarily, it is up to me to make sure I'm like, this is my boundary and you're crossing it right now. I'm not okay with this. We've both decided, then I go, hey, remember when we decided this boundary? We're crossing it right now, whoever it is.
I would say most of the time when people are stepping on your boundaries, they're not meaning to. They just don't have the same boundaries you do, and it's not as big of a deal to them. So you can't put it on your spouse, first of all, to know your boundaries without you clearly conveying them, and then you're going to be ultimately responsible for your own well-being. You should pay attention to the boundaries of the person you're with. You should care about them and do your best to respect them. However, if you're the one that set those boundaries, you can't let people walk on you and just shrug and say, well, I told them my boundaries a long time ago and they just don't respect me.
Now, if you're bringing it up and remind them and it's still not getting addressed, definitely seek out counseling and another form of communicating that so that it doesn't just keep happening. Sit down with your partner and say, hey, let's set up some boundaries.
If you think again about the road example, boundaries aren't to stop traffic. Boundaries are to let traffic flow freely. And in this case, that traffic is love. You want to be able to love in a healthy and efficient manner, and boundaries are in place to help you love better. That could be a boundary. It's like if new episodes of that show come out and you watch it without me, I'm gonna be unhappy.
I was looking at the screen.
What were you doing?
My necklace was weird.
Okay, let me know when you're ready because I'd like to start recording. Okay.
I think like boundaries. Nope.
And if you find this content helpful, maybe subscribe, maybe share it with a friend. You don't have to, but there might be other people who need some boundaries too. Maybe it's your partner.
Definitely share it with your partner.
Yeah. And we'll see you next time.